Hi there, 7th graders. This is chapter 15. I just forgot the title of the chapter. The Spirit of Reform. And this is section 2, Calls for Widespread Education. I will begin reading starting on page 480. Do follow along. The main idea for this section: reformers work to improve the nation's school system. Today we'll learn why reformers thought American education needed to be changed, how American reformers changed education, and why women and minorities had difficulty obtaining an education. Tom huddled in the corner of the schoolroom, his toes and fingers stinging from the cold. According to school rules, Tom had to sit farthest from the stove because his father had not contributed any firewood. Tom could hardly hear the teacher and had no book with which to follow the lesson. Early education in the United States. Tom's day at school was typical for most students in the United States during the early 1800s. Some children did not even have the opportunity to get a meager education like Tom's. Few African Americans, for example, were even allowed to attend school at all. Sectional differences in schools. American schools varied from section to section across the country. As early as 1647, Massachusetts passed a law requiring towns to provide schools for their children. The rest of New England adopted similar laws. The towns, not the states, paid for the schools. Early on, the Middle Atlantic states also took responsibility for education. New York, for instance, organized a school system all the way back in 1784. Private societies, though, had to raise the money to fund the schools. From 1805 to 1852, the Free School Society of New York City supported the city's school system. In 1827, Philadelphians organized a similar society in their city. The federal government mandated education for people in the lands west of New York and north of the Ohio River. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Congress set aside a section of land in each township for the support of schools. Public schools in the North and West seldom had enough money to furnish a good education. Few people made donations to the societies that supported city schools, and the land grants brought little income. Southern schools had even less support. In the South, families had to work so hard to make a living that little time or money was left for schooling. The South was made up of small farms and plantations. Few towns existed to provide schools. Often a local minister taught children from neighboring farms in a school built on an unused field. Well-to-do people in all sections of the country managed to give their children a good education. Many paid for privately operated schools rather than sending their children to public schools supported by a school society or land grants. In the South, wealthy planters hired private tutors for their children and later sent them to Europe to finish their education. Educational reform. Things had to change. During the 1830s, more Americans qualified to vote than ever before. Educational reformers argued that voters needed good educations to make sound decisions about their government. The reformers proposed raising the standards of schools across the nation and supporting them with taxes. To accomplish these goals, they started the Common School movement. Voices for and against change. Not everyone favored common schools, also referred to as free or tax-supported public schools. In the 1830s, few people paid state or federal taxes. As a result, many strongly objected to paying taxes for public schools. Horace Mann of Massachusetts spearheaded the campaign for common schools. Mann was especially concerned about poor children. Their families could not afford to send them to private schools or contribute to the support of the schools in their district. Mann won over taxpayers to his way of thinking by pointing out the benefits to society. He explained that education does better to disarm the poor of their hostility toward the rich. It prevents them being poor. Common schools in the 1800s. In 1837, Mann helped Massachusetts form the first state board of education in the United States. Under his leadership, the board raised teachers' salaries, established statewide standards for education, set up the first schools for teacher training, and extended the school year to 6 months. After many years, the efforts of Mann and other reformers resulted in common schools in most states. During the 1840s and 1850s, the flood of immigrants into the United States helped free public schools gain general acceptance. Many Americans realized that public schools were the ideal agents to teach American values to the new arrivals. The school books already in use were ideal for introducing American values. The popular McGuffey's Reader, for example, focused as often on morals as reading skills. A typical McGuffey exercise read, "Beautiful hands are they that do deeds that are noble, good, and true. Beautiful feet are they that go swiftly to lighten another's woe." Despite advances in public education between 1830 and 1860, schools needed more improvements. School buildings remained inadequate. During the late 1830s, in one Connecticut county, the average school housed 30 students at a time, yet it measured only 7 feet by 18 feet. That's really small. Looking at the classroom here, that's maybe a fourth of what my classroom is here. 30 students in that small of a space. In 1842, Mann compared these cramped quarters for children with the neat buildings complete with walkways that New England farmers built for their hogs. Other areas of education also had not changed or had not changed enough. Most states did not require that students attend school. Others required attendance for only 12 weeks a year, and most students' education ended with the 8th grade. By 1860, only about 40 public high schools existed across the nation, and as late as 1900, only 4% of the population between the ages of 17 and 22 went on to higher education. That would be college after high school. Women, minorities, and schools. Even with reforms, many Americans getting into any kind of school remained a struggle. Most areas of the country neglected the education of women, African Americans, and the physically challenged. Bold and far-sighted reformers, however, took up their cause. Education of American women. By the end of the Revolutionary War, most American elementary schools admitted girls. Girls, however, received only a basic education. Even private schools taught girls morals and manners rather than science and mathematics. In 1819, reformer Emma Willard pointed out to the New York legislature that the education of women had been too exclusively directed to fit them for displaying their charms. 2 years later, Willard remedied the situation by starting the Troy Female Seminary in New York. Parents of students there were shocked to find their daughters studying, among other subjects, anatomy. In 1824, Catherine Beecher founded a similar school in Connecticut, and in 1837, Mary Lyon established Mount Holyoke Seminary in Massachusetts. Oberlin College in Ohio, founded in 1833, admitted women on the college level in 1837. Professional schools continued to reject women applicants until Geneva College admitted Elizabeth Blackwell. In 1849, Blackwell became the first woman in the United States to earn a medical degree. For most women, though, higher education remained out of reach. African American schooling. Few places offered any kind of schooling to African Americans in the early 1800s. Salem, Boston, and New York City were among the exceptions. In the 1830s, Quaker Prudence Crandall opened her school in Connecticut to African American girls from all over the Northeast. Soon after, Connecticut passed a law forbidding schools from accepting out-of-state African American students. Crandall was arrested, tried, and convicted for breaking the law, but a higher court freed her. When Crandall reopened her school in 1834, a mob closed it down. Almost all institutions of higher learning barred African Americans from attending. Two exceptions were Amherst College in Massachusetts and Bowdoin College in Maine. They produced the first African American college graduates in 1826. Pennsylvania opened Lincoln University in 1854. It was the first college in the U.S. exclusively for African Americans. Little progress was made for higher education for African Americans until years after the Civil War. The hearing and visually impaired. Some reformers concentrated on improving education of the hearing and visually impaired. Reverend Thomas Gallaudet went all the way to France to find a teacher for the hearing impaired in the United States. 2 years later, in 1817, Gallaudet opened the first free school for hearing impaired students in Hartford, Connecticut. Massachusetts hired Samuel Gridley Howe to organize the Perkins Institution for the Blind in 1831. Howe ran the Boston School for 44 years. While there, he developed a raised alphabet that enabled the visually impaired to read. He also instructed teachers who eventually taught in other schools for the visually impaired. Horace Mann admired Howe's work so much that he admitted, "I should rather have built up the blind asylum than to have written Hamlet." The nation made headway in the field of education in the 1800s. The words of Thomas Jefferson in 1816 reminded Americans how important it was to continue the progress. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Thanks for listening.